Hello, my name is Kay Blankenship, and I'm the clinical consultant for the HALT Center. And I'm also a licensed clinical professional counselor, and I work in private practice. This training looks at the stages of grief. Many of you who are familiar with the stages of grief will know that they were first researched and developed through a woman named Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. And she wrote a book in 1969 called On Death and Dying. And she was looking at terminal cancer patients, and she realized that they went through these 5 stages. So the first stage was denial, shock, disbelief that the loss occurred. The second was anger, that the loved one is gone. The third was bargaining, the regrets and the what ifs. The fourth stage involved depression or sadness of loss. And the fifth was acknowledging the reality of loss. There are many misconceptions about the 5 stages of grief. The first one is that people must follow the 5 stages. This isn't true. The stages merely reflect where people are. These stages naturally occur in our behavior after the loss. The second misconception is that a person must go through all the stages. Some people may never go through anger or denial, or even some, especially if you're dealing with a traumatic or complicated bereavement, they may never get through the acceptance stage of the loss. The third misconception is that these stages are linear and they must happen one after another, and that isn't true. Grief is like a fingerprint. Each person is unique. The fourth is one must experience exactly these emotions in the 5 stages. And the stages are generally emotions that contain many other emotions. So it's not just these set 5. For example, in the denial stage, it's not uncommon to experience shock. In the anger stage, a person can experience any of the different emotions related to the family of anger: rage, bitterness, annoyance. The bargaining stage, the if-onlys and the what-ifs. The depression stage, sadness, despair, emptiness. Oftentimes when I work with people who are grieving a loss, there's such an immense sense of yearning that it's a physical pain for them. And the 5th stage, acceptance. It means that one acknowledges the loss. It doesn't mean that they're okay with it or they like it, but they acknowledge that it has happened. Going back to, I want to look at this misconception about being a linear progression. Elisabeth Kubler-Ross herself said that these stages were never meant to tuck messy emotions into neat packages. And she said our grieving is as individual as our lives. And that these stages are responses to loss that many people have, but there is no typical response to loss, and there's no typical loss. So when I think about how pop culture and time has used these stages and has created this linear progression that you go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you're all better. And that's really not true. I think this is a great depiction of the different stages people may go through grief, but here's one person griever's experience. David Kessler is a speaker, researcher. He is an expert on bereavement, and he worked closely with Elisabeth Kubler-Ross and even Mother Teresa. And he wrote several books with Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, and then he went on to write another book on the 6th stage of grief, and he had her permission. And for him, after acceptance was finding meaning, which I think makes sense. If you go back to Wolfelt's The 6 Needs of Mourning, and the last one, we talk about support, but one of the stages in Wolfelt and Wharton's was finding acceptance. And I think sometimes people may go through, if you look at the bottom diagram, they may go back and re-experience a different stage at a different time or different emotions. And that's a very natural process, and it's unique to each griever. David Kessler went on and he wrote a book, and he added the 6th stage of grief. And these were some of the responses or quotes from his trainings and workshops that he talks about. And if you go to grief.com, because Love Never Dies is an excellent resource for someone who's grieving, and also just to learn more about grief and different resources. So what David Kessler would say is that meaning doesn't require understanding. It's not necessary to understand why someone died in order to find meaning. And I think that is very useful, and I use and work on this with clients often. Also, that a person's loss is not a test, a lesson, or something to handle. It's not a gift or a blessing. Loss is simply what happens to you in life. Meaning is what you make happen. And this, again, is a little bit similar to Viktor Frankl, if you're familiar with him and the book he wrote after being in a concentration camp in search of meaning, and he went on later to develop logotherapy. When someone dies, the relationship doesn't die with them. So again, if you watch the other two trainings, this fits that theme about going from the relationship still exists, it's just no longer a physical one. And the importance of group work to help someone who is grieving to be able to transition from that physical to more of a connection, and how do you keep their memory in that relationship with the person, even though they're physically no longer here. Death ends a life, but not the relationship, not our love, and not our hope. And ultimately, meaning comes through finding a way to sustain your love for that person after their death while you're moving forward with life. So I hope in looking at the 5 stages of grief, this gave you a little bit different perspective on them, and also maybe gave you some ideas of how you can incorporate some of the lesson plans and activities to address some of the stages, and also to kind of recognize where your client may be at.